Welcome to ReFRAMED, a podcast created to educate, encourage, and inspire parents and professionals. The research is clear. Parenting a child that has a history of loss, abuse, neglect, or trauma requires parenting skills and insight to be reframed. We partner with child welfare experts to bring you evidence-based and research-driven information. ReFRAMED host Emily Morehead, LPC, and guests strive to make an impact on our world by creating conversations about topics that are important to you, your family, and our communities.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of ReFramed. Today I have Robyn Gobbel with us, and we are going to be talking about sensory and emotional regulation. Robyn, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's been really fun to be here. So I'm a psychotherapist. I specialize in working with kids who have experienced a lot of complex trauma. Most of them have been adopted from foster care or possibly internationally. My family and I have just recently relocated to Grand Rapids, Michigan after leaving Austin, Texas, where we lived for 15 years. I had a full-time private practice there. And the vast majority of my caseload has always been working with kids with really significant complex trauma histories.
Okay. And so one of the really interesting things about you is that you are a psychotherapist, but you also have a lot of experience with sensory work and integration with that in your practice. So how did those loves come together for you?
Yeah, well, I mostly out of necessity because I had no idea what I was doing when I first started working with these, like most complex trauma kids. I wasn't adequately trained or prepared. Their bodies were out of control. They were all over the place in my office. My office was getting trashed. I was hurt on more than one occasion. And the reasons for this was because I lacked the skills to know how to support the child, support the environment, support their regulation, and certainly there's no trauma processing being done or attachment work being done when your body is that out of control. Yeah. And so I just had to go on a search to figure out, like, what on earth do I do? Because this can't be it. Like, this can't be therapy. Yeah. And so I just went searching for different things to do. And, you know, over the years, I've had the good fortune of just a lot of really great creative mentors. And have always been interested in just movement work in general, like personally in my own life. If I look back on my life since being a kid, I've always been involved in something that involved movement. Interestingly enough, it's not something I've ever been exceptionally talented at. Like, I've never been a talented athlete or dancer or gymnast or anything like that, but it's just always been a part of my life that I've enjoyed. And so I can see in retrospect, you know, some of why it seemed like a really obvious modality for me to get drawn to. Yeah. And then probably what really gave me the courage to dive into something that felt really natural was reading Dr. Bruce Perry's work and his, research about his neurosequential model, what kids with early complex trauma really need therapeutically, and just validated some of what I felt. It felt right, but I didn't have any science to back it up. Yeah. That we have to get these kids' bodies moving, and we have to help co-organize all of the movement, all the chaos that's happening in their body. It's our job as the adults to move in and attempt to make some sense of that for them so that they can feel better in their bodies. And then kind of an obvious byproduct then of being interested in that kind of work is getting really interested in the sensory system in general. And kids with complex trauma often have disruptions in their sensory system. And so it was mostly just a necessity. If I wanted to get to a place where I could do attachment work, trauma processing work with kids in my office, I had to first know how to help support their body regulation. And it's just not always an option to refer kids out for occupational therapy. Some kids just challenges aren't significant enough that it even meet criteria to go to occupational therapy. There can be barriers for our, funding, and, there's all sorts of reasons why it might be a barrier. I'm certainly not pretending to be an occupational therapist or crossing any of those boundaries, but realizing that the body is a part of people's mental health experience,
Yes, very
right?
much
That we
so.
can't disconnect ourselves and our mind and our emotions from what's happening in our body. And so, and it's just a super fun way to work. Like, it's really fun. So,
I mean, it's such a fun, playful way. I hate admitting this, but I, went to grad school to be a psychotherapist, even specialized in the play therapy track. Not a word about sensory, not a word about regulation. Came to Gladney, and it was like we loved TBRI, Dr. Karen Purvis, Dr. Bruce Perry. We loved Dr. David Cross. And so instantly it was kind of like, if you're going to work with children from hard places, you have to know this. I think before I knew it, when I was practicing, it looked like ADHD. It looked like defiance. And my office was destroyed and I got hurt. So I guess break it down for some of our viewers who may not even have that vocabulary, because it's newer. It's a newer thought process that just not everyone has the education on. And once it clicks, you're like, oh, I have a different lens to view this child and to view their behaviors. So can you give us some hot topic terms that we should know for our base level?
Sure. So the easiest way to think about it is that, kids who experience trauma early in their lives, in utero, as infants and toddlers, the part of their brain that's really working at developing is the part of the brain that's also responsible for the parts of their body that we're not thinking about. So heart rate, respiration, parts of our body that have a rhythm to them, right? Like our heart is beating with a specific rhythm. We're breathing, with a rhythm. So what Dr. Bruce Perry's work helped us see was that to help support these children, we have to support like the rhythm and the autonomic functioning. I'm trying not to use like clinical words. Let's just say the rhythm of their body. And that in a way, this is actually not that difficult because this is how kids are driven to be in the world. They're driven to use their bodies to explore. They're driven to get lots of sensory experiences. All sensory means is that we're using our senses to experience it, that's everything, right? We're using all of our senses all the time. We're touching, we're hearing, we're, tasting. So the word sensory is not intended to be like a mysterious word. It just means like we're using our body in the way that we're taking in what's happening around us. And that kids are kinesthetic, they're moving, they're using their bodies, that's how they're learning and how they're exploring the world. And so if we can lean into this very natural piece of children and then help these kids whose rhythms have been disrupted, and if you think about it, when you think about a child who's really dysregulated, they're lacking like a rhythm to their being, right? They're chaotic, they're all over the place, they're not predictable. And so my work with kids is to see if can I take that, really dysregulated energy, and actually my initial goal isn't to calm them. My initial goal is, can I help their dysregulated energy shift into regulation, meaning that it has some rhythm to it, it has some control to it. Control meaning I could choose to stop this if I wanted. Like it's not overwhelming me. I'm not totally disconnected from my body. That's what I mean by control. So think about, I talk to kids about imagining going to like a jumpaline park or going to recess, or I'll talk to parents about going to a sporting event and it's 10 seconds away from the end and it's like the teams are tied, right? Like there's all this energy, there's so much excitement, but it's not out of control. So that's what we're aiming for. Like this, I'm not trying to calm kids. I want to use their energy, but I want to regulate it and bring some rhythm to it and bring some connection to me and the child and to the child and themselves, because dysregulated children aren't connected to me or themselves.
They're everywhere.
Right, they're just out of control.
Yeah. So when we have a child who's exhibiting these behaviors, what is the question that we're asking to know if they are dysregulated? What are we looking for? What are we seeing in them? And then what would we see for a regulated child? So like specific behavioral attributes.
So my kind of phrase is regulated, connected kids who feel safe and also know what to do behave well. So if you're with a kid whose behaviors are off-putting, or you're not wanting to be in connection or relationship to them, you're finding yourselves annoyed or frustrated or angry or disgusted with them, that's a child who's not regulated. So it doesn't have to be like I'm out of control dysregulated, although that's what I tend to talk about the most, because that's what people are like kind of freaking out about the most, right? Like, help me with this.
It's probably your presenting problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it is important to recognize that subtler, smaller behaviors like opposition or some, low-level defiance, it's still dysregulation. These are still ways of being that aren't letting us see that child's true, like authentic, precious self. But again, most parents initially are really looking for help with the really big, out of control behavior.
I know that in my practice and my work with families, when I say sensory, people go straight to the A word, which is autism. And it's immediate panic. And even some families who are well versed in that community understand the diagnosis of sensory processing disorder.
Right.
So how do we differentiate and explain that those aren't the same? And that, my assumption is that most people have a sensory need.
Yeah, we all, again, that's where I start. Like, we all have sensory preferences, right? That like, I am a coffeeaholic. I'm a coffeeaholic because I love hot beverages. And really what I am is a creamaholic.
Sorry on the room temp water.
Yeah, which is completely wonderful, but I do love really hot coffee with really good cream in it. That the reason I love coffee is because I love the sensory experience. And in general, I love really hot things and I love really cold things. And, all of us have sensory preferences or things that we do to be okay in the world. As adults, for the most part, we have figured out, socially appropriate sensory things that help us be okay. But smoking is a sensory, experience that people do to regulate themselves. When I ask people what their coping skills are, like, what do you do when you're really stressed out or you're really overwhelmed? People almost always identify things that are sensory related. Sometimes it's a kind of a sport thing, or I go for a run, or I do yoga, or I knit. All of those things have a rhythmic component to them, and they all have a sensory component to them. So every single one of us uses the sensory world to regulate. Some kids have unique sensory needs. And so then if that's true about that particular child, then I'll talk about how trauma, abuse, and neglect happens during the time period in which kids are learning about their sensory self, right? We're swaddling kids and we're rocking them and we're, really, rubbing them when we get them out of the bathtub. And there's all these wonderful, just natural baby, toddler experiences that kids are having that are helping to organize their sensory system so that it develops, quote unquote, normally. Like kids with, serious neglect or trauma, their bodies have been hurt or their bodies haven't been touched enough. Their sensory system hasn't developed quite the same way as like their peers. And so we can do some things to help support the way that their sensory system is like navigating the world.
So how do you decide what helps support that?
Mostly we just watch and pay lots of attention. And so I'm telling both parents and clinicians that if we just use our eyes and we pay really good attention, we're getting basically all the information that we need. What kids need our help doing is helping them do these things, again, in a way that actually works for them. So maybe it actually helps regulate them, or it's working for the setting. So an example that comes to mind is early in my career when I knew like this much about this kind of stuff, but still about this much. I had a kid in therapy that every time we would start to do, talk about anything quote unquote hard, usually like reflecting on behaviors from the week, she would flip upside down. So we'd be like, she'd be on the couch or she'd even be on the floor and she would find herself like flipping upside down and like her feet were in the air. And her parents had a very normal parent reaction, which is like, you need to sit up, be respectful, pay attention,
You're
stop
frustrating.
being silly, right? No. Like going upside down is a way to engage a part of the sensory experience that we have to assume is an attempt to bring regulation. We are all always trying to get regulated, always. Nobody wants to stay dysregulated. It's terrible. It feels awful, So when we're doing things, even if they're really bizarre or even if they're ultimately not that helpful, we can assume that the body's doing it because it believes that it will be helpful. So this little kid's thing that she was doing was going upside down. Okay, so in my office, it's fine to be upside down.
Yeah.
Let's just let her stay upside down. It's not super fine to be upside down at math class.
Sure.
While taking a test.
Yeah.
So let's work with that. Like now we know these are some of her cues that she's starting to get dysregulated. She's not being disrespectful. She's not being, not paying attention or whatever label we give that behavior. But also she can't take a math test upside down. So what are things that we can do now that we understand this part of her? Yeah.
So my sister teaches at a STEAM school, and so they have flexible seating and like sit on balls. And she was even talking about the difference in behaviors that she sees in her kiddos. Obviously, every year is different. You have a different set of children. But she was saying it's enabling the children in her class to be able to learn in a way that meets those sensory needs.
Exactly.
And so they are connected. Even if they're bouncing on a ball, that's not looked at as frustrating. That's looked at as you're getting that need met. So I think it's cool that the attention's being brought to it in a better way.
Well, the more we can teach kids about what their body needs in a way that doesn't shame them, the more connected they are to their bodies. And then again, as they get older, they'll be able to choose ways to meet their body's needs that are socially appropriate because they'll be reading the cues from their bodies. They'll know what that cue means and they'll not feel shame about it. And so they'll seek out a coping skill that's appropriate for the setting. Again, like if you're at home watching TV, go ahead and flip upside down. I don't care.
Yeah.
If you're at church, we might want to think about something else. So, but the way, like that's practically the definition of mental health, to like know yourself, know your body, and know what to do to change this, like your state if needed.
Yeah. I think sometimes as adults, we don't have those needs met. So my husband's a fidgeter. And so his coworkers always complain that he is touching things on their desk and moving them around. And so for Christmas, every year I give him a new tangle, which is like, we'll put a link in the show notes for it. You can twist it around. And it's kind of like an anxious response that he has when he's having a stressful conversation. So for that example, it was never labeled a sensory need, that was a tool that he could have. So what do we do if there's adults like my husband who's touching all the things, who just have some needs that maybe we aren't even acknowledging in ourselves, and so therefore we can't see it in our children as a need?
Oh, that's such a great question, because that's really that's like the $1 million question when we're not recognizing stuff in ourselves.
Yeah, and so then it looks frustrating when our kids are doing it.
I think it is so crucial to consider believing that every single thing somebody does is done in an attempt to help themselves feel better.
That's like such a nice thing to say, but so hard.
I know, because we personalize everything and it is so hard. Yeah. But if we can just even increase a teeny tiny bit the amount of which we interact with everybody that way, our spouses, our children, our clients, anybody that's like, what if I believe that this really annoying thing that this person is doing is something that's an attempt to help themselves feel better? Yeah. Well, first of all, that usually decreases my own annoyance. Yeah. Almost always. And then maybe it doesn't decrease my annoyance quite enough, and I need to do something to help this person shift. Yeah. Well, now I have some better ideas. Just like you said, like you bought your husband a tangle, right? Like you
stop touching the stuff.
Right. But you used your eyes to notice that he was touching things and picked something else instead. Like you didn't get him a trampoline. No. Right? Like you used what he was doing and shifted it into something that could be socially appropriate. Because frankly, it's not super socially appropriate to be touching all of your colleagues' stuff all the time.
So Robyn, what tools would you suggest for families to connect with as they observe their child and kind of watch what those needs are?
So there's a really great book called The Out of Sync Child.
It's such a good book.
It's such a good book. And don't let it freak you out that it means your kid has a sensory processing disorder. Again, every single one of us has sensory preferences and sensory needs. And in fact, there's a like questionnaire that I use that's published by the brilliant occupational therapist who developed the ALERT program. That's about like adult sensory preferences. And I'm almost positive that if you Googled it, you'd just find it right on the internet, and it helps you see like what your own sensory preferences are, so that we can just realize like our kids have sensory preferences too. So the Out-of-Sync Child, and there's the Out-of-Sync Child Has Fun, which is this other book, and there's like a set of cards of, you know, activities and fun things you can do with your kid. There's a brilliant occupational therapist in Austin named Marty Smith. Do you know Marty?
I don't.
Oh, she's so wonderful. I
feel
should
like
connect
we
you
need
to
to
her.
connect,
Yes.
yeah.
You need to know Marty. But Marty has also like a video podcast that has really brilliant, wonderful, amazing sensory tips on it. So I send parents to that all the time. Like, she's funny and endearing, and she's just fun to watch, and a really great resource for parents looking for how to support their kids, you know, sensory world. And I have a couple webinars specific to it.
Awesome.
On my website.
We'll definitely link that in our show notes. So I want to ask you one fun question.
Okay.
So how do you support your sensory needs? Do you have any weird things that have to have some mitigation to, or fun little quirks?
Well, I like really hot coffee.
Yeah.
But you know, the thing that I do that supports my sensory needs in kind of a fun, quirky way is that I've started taking aerial silks lessons.
So fun.
Yeah, it is so fun. And I am a person who craves the sensory input of proprioception, which is sensory input that's taken in through our muscles, tendons, and joints. So we're getting it when we get, you know, pressure, and, you know, even when we're walking, we're getting it through our legs. And like, I drive with like one leg up, you know, like my left leg is always way up here when I'm driving, because I'm getting extra proprioception in that way. And so being like tangled up by a silk, hanging in the air, and sometimes going upside down, because I also really love to be upside down, is a very adaptive, appropriate way I've found.
Great workout.
Exactly. To meet my sensory needs, because I like to move a lot, and I am always kind of craving input into my body. And so, and in a way, that has become in a very, again, socially appropriate adaptive way is that I've long distance run, and you know, I like to work out, and it really, like, I'm not good at these things. I'm just you know, less than average.
But you
athlete.
seek joy in it.
Exactly. I love it, and it helps my body feel good. And now I understand why. Like, I understand why I crave the movement. And
so, Robyn, how do our viewers stay connected with you? How they can connect with some of the resources that you talked about today as well?
Yeah, I'm really easy to find online. So I blog. You can find my blog by going to my website, gobbelcounseling.com. I have a pretty active presence on both Facebook and Instagram. I do a lot of training for both parents and professionals, and I do a decent amount of that just online in webinar format. So they're affordable, accessible. You can get them as recordings, so you can view them whenever you want to and as often as you want to. So I work really hard to make resources, you know, as accessible to people as possible.
And you have one that builds specifically off of this podcast, correct?
I do, yes.
Okay, great. And can you tell us what the title of that one is?
Yes, if I can remember. It's called Regulating the Body with Sensory-Based Interventions.
Okay, great. That's a really helpful resource, because it does build off a lot of the conversation. I got to attend that one, and it's really cool. Yeah. Well, we will put all the links to Robyn's contact information in our show notes, as well as resources to connect with your child with their sensory needs, as well as maybe your own. Thanks for tuning in today.
Thanks for listening to ReFRAMED. Visit gladneyuniversity.org to access the show notes and learn about upcoming trainings at Gladney University. We'd love your feedback, so please rate, review, and subscribe. Until next time.